Life has a way of stripping away everything you thought you could count on. Ray Morgan learned this lesson the hardest way possible at 54, when a steady job, a 20-year marriage, and a roof over his head all disappeared within 6 months. The only thing that remained constant was Daisy, his golden retriever, who had been his faithful companion through every sleepless night on park benches and every cold morning searching for shelter. Ray had rescued her from the city pound 6 years earlier, choosing the older dog that no one else wanted. Now she was all he had left in the world. On this grey Tuesday morning in Springfield's municipal courthouse, Ray faced 30 days in county jail for trespassing in an abandoned building. He could handle the jail time, but what destroyed him was knowing Daisy would be sent to the shelter while he was gone. At her age, she would likely never make it out alive. As Ray knelt on the courtroom floor in his worn sneakers, saying what he believed would be his final goodbye to the dog who had never left his side, could anyone have predicted what would happen next? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 years earlier, Ray Morgan had been a different man entirely. He'd clocked in at Springfield Manufacturing every morning at 7 sharp for 23 years, his company badge dangling from a worn lanyard around his neck like a badge of honor. The plant made automotive parts, and Ray worked the quality control line, checking each piece with the methodical precision that had earned him 3 Employee of the Month awards and the quiet respect of his supervisors. Margaret used to pack his lunch in a brown paper bag, always including a handwritten note on a yellow sticky pad. "Have a good day, honey," or "Don't forget we have dinner with the Hendersons tonight." Small gestures that made their modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street feel like home. They'd bought it when Ray was 31, Margaret 28, both of them convinced they were building something that would last forever. Their marriage hadn't been passionate, but it had been steady. Margaret worked part-time at the local library, and they'd fallen into comfortable routines. Saturday morning grocery shopping, Sunday dinners at her mother's house, 2 weeks at a lake cabin in Michigan every August. They'd tried for children in their early years, but after Margaret's second miscarriage, they'd quietly stopped trying and never spoke of it again. Instead, they'd poured their care into their small garden, Margaret's book club, and Ray's weekend projects in the garage. The day Ray found Daisy changed everything, though neither of them realized it at the time. It was a Saturday in November, and Ray had been driving home from the hardware store when he passed the animal shelter. Something made him pull into the parking lot. Maybe it was the sign that read Senior Pet Adoption Event, or maybe it was just curiosity. Inside, dozens of older dogs waited behind chain-link gates, their eyes holding the patient sadness of animals who understood they might never leave. Daisy had been returned twice. The volunteer, a young woman with kind eyes, explained that her first family had found her too energetic, and her second had complained she was too needy. At 6 years old, she was considered a senior dog, harder to place than the puppies that drew most visitors' attention. But when Ray knelt down and extended his hand through the gate, Daisy had pressed her golden snout against his palm with a gentleness that spoke of unconditional trust. "She's been waiting for the right person," the volunteer had said softly. Margaret had been less enthusiastic when Ray arrived home with Daisy in the back seat of their Honda Civic. "We never talked about getting a dog," she'd said, though she wasn't unkind about it. "You should have asked me first." But watching Ray with Daisy over the following weeks, Margaret had seen something she hadn't witnessed in years, a lightness in her husband's step, a smile that came easier, a purpose beyond the daily routine of work and home. Daisy followed Ray everywhere, content to lie at his feet while he worked in the garage or watch him through the kitchen window while he grilled hamburgers on their small deck. The first signs of trouble at Springfield Manufacturing came in the form of rumors, whispers about corporate restructuring and cost-cutting measures. Ray, like most of his co-workers, dismissed the talk as the kind of speculation that always swirled through factory floors. He'd survived 2 smaller layoffs in previous years, and his seniority and solid record made him feel secure. The announcement came on a Thursday morning in March. The plant manager, a man Ray had known for 15 years, called all employees to the main floor. His voice cracked as he explained that the company was closing the Springfield facility and moving operations to Mexico. All 247 workers would be laid off by the end of June. Severance packages would be based on years of service, and the company would provide job placement assistance. Ray received 12 weeks of severance pay. At 53, with a high school education and 2 decades of manufacturing experience, he'd felt confident about finding new work. The unemployment office provided him with leads, and he submitted applications to every factory, warehouse, and maintenance company within a 50-mile radius. Interviews were scarce, and the few he managed rarely led to callbacks. Margaret tried to be supportive, but as spring turned to summer and Ray's unemployment benefits dwindled, tension crept into their conversations. Small disagreements about money became larger arguments about their future. Margaret suggested Ray consider going back to school, maybe learning a trade like plumbing or electrical work. Ray, proud and stubborn, insisted he could find something on his own. The unemployment checks stopped coming in August. By October, they'd fallen 3 months behind on their mortgage. Margaret had increased her library hours, but her part-time salary couldn't cover their basic expenses. The credit cards they'd rarely used were maxed out. The small savings account they'd built over 20 years was empty. The evening Margaret asked for a divorce, Ray was in the garage organizing his tools for what felt like the 100th time. She stood in the doorway, holding a manila envelope, her face painted with a sadness Ray had never seen before. "I can't do this anymore," she said quietly. "I love you, Ray, but I can't watch you disappear like this." Ray didn't argue. He understood, in the way that people who've been married for 2 decades understand each other's pain. Margaret wasn't abandoning him. She was saving herself from drowning alongside him. The papers were already drawn up. She'd keep the house, at least until it was foreclosed on. Ray could take his tools, his clothes, and Daisy. He spent his last night in their bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Margaret's quiet sobs from the guest room. Daisy lay on the floor beside him, her warm presence the only comfort in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. The next morning, Ray loaded his pickup truck with everything he owned. His toolbox, 2 suitcases of clothes, a sleeping bag, and a box of Daisy's toys and food. Margaret stood on the front porch, arms wrapped around herself against the November cold. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You too," Ray replied, lifting Daisy into the truck's cab. As he drove away from Maple Street for the last time, Ray caught sight of Margaret in his rearview mirror, still standing on the porch. He thought about the 20 years they'd shared, the quiet contentment they'd built together, and how quickly it had all crumbled. But when Daisy placed her paw on his arm and looked at him with those trusting brown eyes, Ray knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. The first night on the streets, they slept in the truck behind a 24-hour diner. Ray had spread his sleeping bag across the bench seat, and Daisy curled up beside him, her steady breathing a reassurance in the darkness. Looking back, Ray would remember that night not for the fear or uncertainty, but for the moment he realized that home wasn't a place. It was whoever stayed with you when everything else fell apart. The abandoned riverside warehouse had become Ray and Daisy's refuge during the harsh October nights. The massive brick building sat empty on the outskirts of Springfield's industrial district, its broken windows boarded up and weeds growing through cracks in the loading dock. Most importantly, it was dry and offered protection from the wind that cut through their thin layers like a knife. Ray had discovered the building 3 weeks earlier while walking Daisy along the Sangamon River. A loose board in the rear wall provided access to a small office space that still had most of its roof intact. He'd made a modest camp there, his sleeping bag in one corner, Daisy's food and water bowls near the door, and a small battery-powered lantern that provided just enough light to read the paperback novels he borrowed from the public library. On this particular Tuesday night, the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees, and Ray could see Daisy shivering despite her thick golden coat. At 9 years old, she wasn't as resilient as she'd once been, and Ray worried constantly about her health. He'd managed to find a discarded piece of carpet behind a furniture store, and he'd layered it beneath their sleeping area to provide extra insulation from the concrete floor. "And come here, girl," Ray whispered, patting his sleeping bag. Daisy padded over on stiff legs and settled against his chest, her warmth immediately comforting. Ray had given her the last of their food that evening, half a can of dog food he'd bought with coins scrounged from his truck's console. His own stomach ached with hunger, but Daisy's needs always came first. Ray had been drifting towards sleep when he heard footsteps outside, heavy boots on gravel, getting closer. He held his breath and felt Daisy's body tense beside him. A flashlight beam swept across the boarded windows, casting moving shadows on the walls. "I know someone's in there," called a gruff voice. "This is private property. Come out with your hands visible." Ray's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd been careful, never leaving trash or obvious signs of occupancy. He'd used the building's old employee restroom sparingly and always cleaned up after himself. But somehow, he'd been discovered. "Please," Ray called out, his voice steady despite his fear. "I'm coming out. I have a dog with me. She's friendly. Just get out here nice and slow," the security guard replied. Ray clipped Daisy's worn red collar around her neck, the nameplate gleaming dully in the lantern light. The collar had been one of his first purchases after adopting her, engraved simply with Daisy and his old phone number from the house on Maple Street. He'd never had it updated, somehow unable to accept the permanence of his new circumstances. When Ray emerged from the building with Daisy at his side, he found himself facing a heavy-set security guard and 2 Springfield police officers. The cops looked tired, like men who'd seen too many situations like this one. "Sir, you're trespassing on private property," the older officer said, pulling out his notebook. "Can I see some identification?" Ray handed over his driver's license. Expired 3 months ago because he couldn't afford the renewal fee. Officer Martinez, his nameplate read, examined it under his flashlight. "Ray Morgan, 54, last address on Maple Street," Martinez read aloud. "You don't live there anymore?" "No, sir," Ray replied quietly. "I'm between places right now." The younger officer, Thompson, according to his badge, was already on his radio calling in Ray's information. Within minutes, they'd confirmed he had no outstanding warrants and no history of violent crimes. Still, trespassing was trespassing. "Mr. Morgan, I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back," Martinez said, producing handcuffs. "You're under arrest for criminal trespass." Ray nodded and complied, but as the metal cuffs clicked around his wrists, Daisy began to whine. She pressed against Ray's legs, her tail tucked low, sensing that something terrible was happening. "What about my dog?" Ray asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Animal control is on the way," Thompson said. "They'll take her to the city shelter." Ray's knees nearly buckled. The city shelter. He'd heard the stories from other homeless people, overcrowded, underfunded, with a euthanization rate that climbed higher every year. Dogs like Daisy, older and without a home to return to, rarely lasted more than a few weeks. "Please," Ray said, desperation creeping into his voice. "She's never hurt anyone. She's just an old dog." "Can't someone—" "I'm sorry, sir," Martinez said, and he genuinely sounded like he meant it. "It's procedure. The dog will be cared for at the shelter." The animal control truck arrived 15 minutes later, a white van with Springfield Animal Services painted on the side. The driver was a middle-aged woman named Carol, who handled Daisy with professional gentleness, but her eyes were sad as she led the golden retriever toward the van's cage. Ray watched helplessly as Daisy was loaded into the truck. She looked back at him through the wire mesh, her brown eyes full of confusion and trust. Even now, being taken away from the only person who cared about her, she didn't understand that Ray had failed to protect her. "I'll find you," Ray called out as the van pulled away. "I promise, girl, I'll find you." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. From the back seat of the patrol car, Ray watched his and Daisy's makeshift home grow smaller in the distance. The sleeping bag, the food bowls, the small battery lantern, all evidence of a life lived in the margins, now abandoned to the elements. At the county jail, Ray was processed with the efficient compassion of people who handled similar situations. Every night, his belongings were catalogued and stored: worn wallet containing 347, a house key he'd never thrown away, and a small photo of him and Margaret from their 10th anniversary. No phone, no credit cards, no connection to the world he'd once been part of. The intake officer, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, asked standard questions about his health, next of kin, and emergency contacts. Ray gave Margaret's information, though he doubted she'd want to be bothered with his problems. They hadn't spoken since the divorce papers were signed 6 months ago. Ray's cell was a 6 by 8 foot concrete box he shared with a man named Eddie Rodriguez, who was serving the last week of a 30-day sentence for public intoxication. Eddie was perhaps 60 years old, with graying hair and hands that shook slightly, whether from age, alcohol withdrawal, or both. Ray couldn't tell. "First time inside?" Eddie asked as Ray settled onto the thin mattress of his bunk. "Yeah," Ray admitted. Eddie nodded knowingly. "You got that look, like someone who still believes things are going to work out. What'd you do?" "Trespassing. I was sleeping in an abandoned building with my dog." "They take your dog?" Ray's throat tightened. "Yeah, to the shelter." Eddie was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "I'm sorry, man. That's the hardest part about being in here, worrying about who's taking care of the things that matter to you." Ray lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, where someone had carved "Hope" in small letters near the corner. Outside, somewhere, across the city, Daisy was probably lying on a concrete floor, just like this one, wondering why the person she trusted most had disappeared. Ray closed his eyes and tried to calculate how long she might survive in the shelter system. At 9 years old, with no cute puppy appeal and no family looking for her, the math was brutal. For the first time since losing his job, his marriage, and his home, Ray Morgan broke down and cried. The Sangamon County Public Defender's Office operated out of a cramped suite on the 3rd floor of the courthouse building, its waiting room furnished with mismatched chairs and outdated magazines. Ray sat among a dozen other defendants, all waiting for their assigned attorneys to review cases that would determine the next chapter of their lives. Sarah Chen appeared in the doorway at exactly 9:15, calling Ray's name from a legal pad covered in her neat handwriting. She was younger than Ray had expected, maybe early 30s, with shoulder-length black hair pulled into a practical ponytail and dark circles under intelligent brown eyes that spoke of too many late nights. "And too much coffee." "Mr. Morgan," she said, extending a firm handshake. "I'm Sarah Chen, your public defender. Let's find somewhere we can talk." Her office was barely larger than Ray's jail cell, with law books stacked on every available surface and a desktop computer that looked like it belonged in a museum. Sarah cleared a pile of files from the chair across from her desk and gestured for Ray to sit down. "I've reviewed the police report from your arrest," she began, opening a manila folder with his name written in red ink. "Criminal trespass in the 3rd degree. The security guard called it in after finding evidence of habitation in the abandoned warehouse. You admitted to sleeping there?" "Yes, ma'am," Ray said quietly. "I wasn't trying to steal anything or cause trouble. I just needed somewhere dry for me and my dog." Sarah made a note on her legal pad. "Tell me about your circumstances. How long have you been homeless?" Ray explained about losing his job at Springfield Manufacturing, the divorce, the gradual slide from unemployment into life on the streets. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions about his work history, military service, and criminal background, or lack thereof. You served in the army? She asked, looking up from her notes. 4 years, 1987 to 1991. I was stationed at Fort Campbell, did 2 tours in Germany. Honorable discharge. Sarah made another note. Any combat experience? No, ma'am. I worked supply logistics. Nothing dramatic. When Ray finished his story, Sarah leaned back in her chair and studied him for a long moment. In her 3 years as a public defender, she'd represented hundreds of clients facing similar charges. Most were repeat offenders cycling through the system, struggling with addiction or mental illness, or simply unable to find stable housing. But Ray struck her as different, a man whose circumstances had changed faster than his character could adapt. Mr. Morgan, I need to be honest with you about what we're facing, Sarah said. This is your first offense, which works in our favor. However, the prosecutor's office has been taking a harder line on trespassing cases lately. The property owner, Springfield Development Group, has been lobbying for stricter enforcement. Ray's stomach dropped. What does that mean? In practical terms, it means they're unlikely to offer you a deal for just community service or time served. We're probably looking at 30 days in county jail, maybe more. 30 days. Ray did the math quickly. The Springfield Animal Shelter kept unclaimed dogs for 10 days before they became eligible for euthanization. After that, it was just a matter of available space and resources. A 9-year-old golden retriever with no adoption prospects wouldn't last long. My dog, Ray said urgently. She's at the city shelter. If I'm in jail for 30 days, I understand your concern, Sarah said gently. But right now, we need to focus on your case. Is there anyone who could take care of your dog while you serve your sentence? Ray thought about Margaret, but dismissed the idea immediately. She was allergic to dogs, and their relationship had ended with enough pain that he couldn't bear to drag her into his current crisis. He had no siblings, and his parents had died years earlier. His few remaining friendships had faded after he lost his job and became someone people felt sorry for, rather than someone they wanted to spend time with. No, he said quietly. There's nobody. Sarah made another note, her expression sympathetic but professional. Let's talk about your options. We could fight the charge, try to argue necessity, that you were seeking shelter for basic survival needs. But that's a risky strategy, and if we lose, the judge might impose a harsher sentence. What's the alternative? We plead guilty and ask for the minimum sentence. 30 days, possibly, with credit for time served. You'd be out in 3 weeks. 3 weeks was still too long. Ray knew it, and from Sarah's expression he suspected she knew it too. But it was the best option in a situation with no good choices. I want to plead guilty, Ray said. I did what they said I did. I just want to get this over with so I can find my dog. Sarah nodded, making a final note in his file. I'll schedule a plea hearing for tomorrow morning. Judge Patricia Henley is presiding, and she's generally fair in her sentencing. I'll do my best to emphasize your clean record and the circumstances that led to this situation. The next morning, Ray found himself standing before Judge Patricia Henley in a courtroom that smelled of wood polish and anxiety. Judge Henley was perhaps 55 years old, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and reading glasses that she peered over when addressing defendants. Her reputation was that of a stern but fair jurist who took the time to understand the people who appeared before her bench. Mr. Morgan, she said, reviewing the file Sarah had submitted, you're pleading guilty to criminal trespass in the 3rd degree. Is this plea made freely and voluntarily? Yes, Your Honor, Ray replied. I see from your record that this is your first offense. Miss Chen, what can you tell me about your client's circumstances? Sarah stood and spoke for 5 minutes about Ray's employment history, his military service, and the series of unfortunate events that had led to his homelessness. She emphasized his cooperation with arresting officers and his genuine remorse for violating the property owner's rights. Judge Henley listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Ray over her glasses. When Sarah finished, the judge was quiet. For a long moment, Mr. Morgan, do you have anything you'd like to say before I impose sentence? Ray stood, his heart pounding. Your Honor, I know I broke the law. I'm not trying to make excuses. I just want to get back to my dog. She's 9 years old and she's at the shelter, and I'm the only family she has. If I could just... Mr. Morgan, Judge Henley interrupted gently, I appreciate your honesty. However, I need to focus on the legal matter before me. I'm sentencing you to 30 days in the county jail with credit for time served. That means you'll be released in 26 days. 26 days. Ray's heart sank, but he managed to nod respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. As the bailiff prepared to escort him back to his cell, Ray caught sight of Sarah gathering her papers. She looked up and gave him a small, encouraging nod, the kind of gesture that meant more than she probably realized to someone who felt completely alone in the world. The Springfield Animal Shelter's intake form for Daisy Morgan lay on the small table in the jail's attorney conference room, a single sheet of paper that represented the bureaucratic machinery threatening to separate Ray from the only family he had left. Sarah Chen had brought the form along with a thick folder containing information about animal rescue organizations, veterans services, and housing assistance programs that Ray had never known existed. Grace Williams runs a dog rescue operation about 20 miles south of here, Sarah explained, spreading several brochures across the table. She specializes in senior dogs that other organizations have trouble placing. She's agreed to consider fostering Daisy while you serve your sentence, but she wants to meet with you first. Ray studied the photographs in one of the brochures. Older dogs in various stages of recovery, lying on comfortable beds or playing in fenced yards that looked nothing like the concrete runs at the city shelter. Why would she help someone like me? He asked. Because she understands that the bond between people and their pets doesn't disappear when people fall on hard times, Sarah replied. Grace has been doing rescue work for 15 years. She's seen plenty of situations where good people lose their animals due to circumstances beyond their control. Ray picked up Daisy's intake form and read through the clinical language that reduced his companion to a series of checkboxes and measurements. Female golden retriever, approximately 9 years old, 37 inches long, 62 pounds, red collar with nameplate. The form noted that she was cooperative but depressed and had refused food for 3 consecutive days. The fact that Daisy wasn't eating scared Ray more than his own legal troubles. During their months on the streets, she'd always maintained her appetite even when food was scarce. Ray had often given her his own meals, watching her eat with the satisfaction of knowing that at least one of them was being properly nourished. What happens if Grace decides not to help? Ray asked, though he dreaded the answer. Sarah's expression grew serious. Ray, I'm not going to lie to you. Daisy's been at the shelter for 8 days. The 10-day holding period for strays expires tomorrow, after which she becomes available for adoption. But at her age, and with her current behavioral state, the chances of someone adopting her are minimal. Ray understood what Sarah wasn't saying directly. If Grace Williams declined to foster Daisy, and if no one adopted an older, depressed dog, within the next few weeks, Daisy would be euthanized to make room for younger, more adoptable animals. How soon can I meet with Grace? Ray asked. She's driving up from Springfield this afternoon. The meeting is scheduled for 3 o'clock. Sarah gathered the brochures and forms into a neat stack. Ray, I need you to understand that this isn't just about Daisy. Grace is considering offering you housing and work when you're released from jail, but she needs to be convinced that you're serious about rebuilding your life. Ray had been dreading this conversation since Sarah first mentioned Grace's offer. After months of rejection from employers, landlords, and social service agencies, the idea of another person evaluating his worthiness felt almost unbearable. But Daisy's life hung in the balance, and Ray would endure any amount of scrutiny if it meant saving her. What kinds of questions will she ask? Ray inquired. She'll want to know about your plans for employment, housing, and long-term stability. She'll ask about your relationship with Daisy and your commitment to providing proper care for an aging dog. Most importantly, she'll try to assess whether you're someone who follows through on promises or someone who makes commitments they can't keep. Ray spent the hours before his meeting with Grace Williams, thinking about how to explain his situation without sounding like he was making excuses. The truth was complicated. He'd lost his job through no fault of his own, but his pride and stubbornness had prevented him from seeking help until it was too late. His marriage had failed, partly due to circumstances, but also due to his inability to communicate effectively with Margaret during their crisis. When Grace Williams entered the attorney conference room at exactly 3 o'clock, Ray's first impression was of someone who'd spent her life working with animals. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver-grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and hands that showed the wear of daily physical labor. Her clothes were clean but practical: jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. "Mr. Morgan," Grace said, extending a firm handshake. "I'm Grace Williams. Sarah has told me about your situation with Daisy." "Mrs. Williams," Ray replied, standing respectfully. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate you considering helping us. Daisy means everything to me." Grace settled into her chair and opened a notebook filled with what appeared to be detailed notes about Ray's case. "Mr. Morgan, I've been doing animal rescue work for 15 years, and I've learned to ask direct questions. Are you ready for that?" Ray nodded, though his stomach clenched with anxiety. "Tell me about your relationship with Daisy. How long have you had her, and what made you choose an older dog when you adopted her?" Ray found himself relaxing slightly as he talked about the day he'd found Daisy at the animal shelter 6 years earlier. He described her gentle temperament, her loyalty during the difficult months after his divorce, and her companionship during the terrifying transition to homelessness. "She never complained," Ray said quietly. "When we were sleeping in my truck, when we had to walk miles to find a place that would let us stay warm for a few hours, when I could only afford to feed one of us, she never showed anything but trust and affection." Grace made notes as Ray spoke, occasionally asking follow-up questions about Daisy's health, behavior, and daily routine. Ray could see that she was evaluating not just his answers, but his emotional connection to his dog and his understanding of her needs. "Mr. Morgan, Sarah tells me you're interested in working at my rescue operation when you're released from jail. What makes you think you'd be suitable for that kind of work?" Ray had anticipated this question, but answering it required him to be honest about skills and qualities he wasn't sure he possessed. "I don't have experience with animal rescue," he admitted, "but I know what it's like to need help and not know where to find it. I understand what it means to be overlooked or written off because of your circumstances. Maybe that would make me more patient with animals that other people have given up on." Grace studied Ray's face as he spoke, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of being assessed by someone who'd developed keen instincts about human character through years of dealing with people in crisis. "My husband Tom and I live on 10 acres south of Springfield," Grace said. "We have a guest cottage that we sometimes offer to people who are helping with rescue operations. It's not much, one room with a kitchenette and bathroom, but it would provide housing while you look for permanent employment and get back on your feet." Ray felt his throat tighten with emotion. After months of having doors slammed in his face, this stranger was offering him not just help with Daisy, but a chance to rebuild his entire life. "Why would you take a risk on someone like me?" Ray asked. Grace closed her notebook and looked at Ray directly. "Because 15 years ago, my husband and I were in our own kind of crisis. Tom had been laid off from his job. I was working double shifts to keep us afloat, and we were both drinking too much and heading toward divorce. A friend suggested we volunteer at the animal shelter, thinking it might give us something positive to focus on together." She paused, seeming to consider how much of her personal story to share. "That work saved our marriage and gave us purpose when we felt like failures in every other part of our lives. Now we have the resources to help other people who are facing similar challenges." Sometimes the best way to heal from your own problems is to help others solve theirs. Ray sat in silence for a moment, processing the magnitude of what was being offered to him. What would I need to do to qualify for your help? First, you'd need to sign papers giving me temporary custody of Daisy. I'll pick her up from the shelter tomorrow morning and bring her to our property, where she'll be safe and cared for until you're released. Grace pulled forms from her folder. Second, you'd need to complete your jail sentence without any disciplinary problems. Third, when you're released, you'd commit to working at the rescue operation for at least 6 months, while you look for permanent employment and housing. Ray reviewed the custody papers, noting that they included provisions for him to reclaim Daisy once he demonstrated stable housing and income. The legal language was straightforward, but signing the documents felt like the most important decision he'd made since adopting Daisy 6 years earlier. There's one more thing, Grace added. Sarah has been in contact with veterans services organizations about your situation. There are programs available that could help with job training, healthcare, and housing assistance. Part of accepting my help would involve working with those organizations to access services you're entitled to as a veteran. Ray had been reluctant to identify himself as a veteran needing assistance, but he was beginning to understand that pride had been a luxury he couldn't afford when Daisy's life was at stake. What kinds of programs? Grace handed him several brochures from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Housing vouchers, job placement services, healthcare benefits, and counseling services if you need them. The key is connecting with these resources before you're released from jail, so you have support systems in place rather than trying to navigate everything alone. Ray signed the custody papers. He felt as though he was signing away part of himself, but he also felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope that the future might hold possibilities beyond mere survival. Mrs. Williams, Ray said, as he handed back the completed forms, I don't know how to thank you for this chance. I won't let you down. Grace gathered her papers and stood to leave. Mr. Morgan, the best way to thank me is to take advantage of this opportunity to rebuild your life. And Ray, call me Grace. We're going to be working together for a while. That evening, Ray lay on his bunk and tried to process the day's developments. In the space of a few hours, his situation had transformed from hopeless to promising. Daisy would be safe, he would have housing when he was released, and he would have meaningful work that might lead to permanent employment. Eddie Rodriguez had been listening to Ray's account of the meeting with obvious amazement. Man, you just hit the lottery, Eddie said. I've been in and out of this system for 5 years, and I've never seen anyone get the kind of comprehensive help you're being offered. Ray understood how fortunate he was, but he also felt the weight of responsibility that came with Grace's investment in his future. What if I can't live up to her expectations? He asked. Eddie turned to face Ray directly. Then you figure out how to exceed them. Ray, second chances like this don't come along often. When they do, you grab hold with both hands and don't let go. The next morning, Sarah Chen brought news that Grace had successfully taken custody of Daisy and transported her to the rescue facility. Grace said Daisy seemed to understand that something positive was happening, Sarah reported. She ate a full meal for the first time in over a week. Ray felt tears of relief that he'd been holding back for days. Daisy was safe. Whatever challenges lay ahead in rebuilding his own life, at least he wouldn't have to live with the knowledge that his circumstances had cost Daisy her life. And there's something else, Sarah continued. The local newspaper wants to do a follow-up story about your case, focusing on the community response and the resources available to help people in situations like yours. You don't have to participate, but it might help other people understand that homelessness and poverty aren't moral failings. Ray had never thought of his story as newsworthy, but he was beginning to understand that his experience represented larger issues affecting many people in his community. If sharing his story could help other people access the resources and support he'd been offered, then perhaps his lowest moment could serve some useful purpose. I'll do the interview, Ray decided. If it helps other people, then it's worth the embarrassment. As Ray counted down his remaining days in jail, he allowed himself to imagine a future that extended beyond simply surviving until the next meal or finding a warm place to sleep. For the first time in months, he was making plans, learning about dog rescue operations, researching veterans services, and thinking about the kind of person he wanted to become when he walked out of jail and began rebuilding his life with Daisy by his side. Margaret arrived at the Sangamon County Jail on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a small paper bag and wearing the blue hand-knitted scarf she'd made for Ray during their third winter together. The visiting room smelled of industrial disinfectant and contained a dozen plastic chairs arranged around metal tables, with corrections officers watching from the corners. Ray hadn't seen his ex-wife since the day he'd loaded his truck and driven away from their house 8 months earlier. She looked older, he thought, as she settled into the chair across from him. There were new lines around her eyes, and grey streaks in her brown hair that she wasn't bothering to colour anymore. But she also looked more at peace somehow, as if the stress of their failing marriage had been replaced by a different kind of sadness, one that came from accepting painful truths rather than fighting them. "I brought you some books," Margaret said, sliding the paper bag across the table. "I wasn't sure what you'd want to read, so I picked some mysteries and a biography of Harry Truman." "Thank you," Ray said, genuinely touched. "How did you know I was here?" "Sarah Chen called me. She said you'd listed me as an emergency contact." Margaret's voice was careful, measured. "She told me about Daisy." Ray's throat tightened. Of all the losses he'd endured over the past year, the thought of losing Daisy felt like the one that might break him completely. "I don't know what's going to happen to her. Sarah mentioned a woman who might help, Grace Williams. She runs some kind of dog rescue?" Ray nodded. "Sarah's trying to arrange something, but I don't know if it'll work out. Grace wants to meet me first, make sure I'm serious about getting Daisy back." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying Ray's face with the attention of someone who'd once known him better than anyone. "You look different," she said finally. "Different how?" "Thinner, obviously, but also, I don't know. Like you've stopped pretending things are going to go back to the way they were." Ray considered this. In their final months together, he'd clung to the belief that his unemployment was temporary, that their marriage could survive if he just found the right job, made the right adjustments. He'd been unwilling to accept that some changes were permanent, that life sometimes stripped away everything you thought you needed and forced you to discover what actually mattered. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," he said. Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, the first physical contact they'd had since the divorce. "I've been reading about you in the paper." Ray looked puzzled. "What paper?" "The State Journal Register. There was an article yesterday about homelessness in Springfield. You were mentioned, not by name, but I recognized the details. A 54-year-old veteran arrested for trespassing, worried about his dog at the animal shelter." Ray felt a flush of embarrassment. The idea of his personal struggles being discussed in the newspaper made him feel exposed in a way that even jail couldn't match. "What did it say?" "It talked about how the homeless population has grown since the plant closures. How many of the people sleeping rough are working people who lost their jobs and couldn't keep up with their rent." The reporter interviewed several social workers and mentioned your case as an example of how the system sometimes criminalize people for trying to survive. Margaret pulled a folded newspaper clipping from her purse and slid it across the table. Ray read it quickly, recognizing his own story in the careful, anonymous details. The article was sympathetic but matter-of-fact, treating homelessness as a policy issue rather than a moral failing. "There's something else," Margaret said. "The article mentioned that local animal advocates have been following your case. Apparently, there's been some community interest in helping with Daisy's care." Before Ray could respond, a corrections officer announced that visiting hours would end in 10 minutes. Margaret gathered her purse and stood to leave, but she paused at Ray's shoulder. "I know things ended badly between us," she said quietly. "I know I hurt you by asking for the divorce. But Ray, You're a good man who got caught up in circumstances beyond your control. Don't let this experience convince you otherwise." Ray watched her walk away, the blue scarf trailing behind her like a small flag of truce in a war that had finally ended. The next afternoon, Sarah Chen returned with news that changed everything. Grace Williams had agreed to meet with Ray and potentially foster Daisy, but first she wanted to visit the shelter and assess the dog's condition for herself. "She's been doing rescue work for 15 years, Sarah explained. "She's fostered over 200 dogs, mostly seniors that other organizations won't take, but she's very selective about which cases she accepts. She wants to make sure she's not enabling someone who won't follow through on their commitments." Grace Williams was 63 years old and had the weathered hands and no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent her retirement years cleaning kennels and administering medications to animals other people had given up on. She lived on 10 acres outside Springfield with her husband Tom, and their property included a half-dozen outbuildings that had been converted into recovery spaces for dogs with medical or behavioral issues. When Grace visited the shelter on Friday morning, Maria Santos gave her a complete tour of the facility, explaining their policies and showing her the kennel records that tracked each animal's timeline. Grace had seen hundreds of shelters over the years, and she recognized the signs of an operation that was doing its best with inadequate resources. Daisy was sleeping when Grace approached her kennel, but she lifted her head when Grace spoke her name. Grace knelt by the fence and extended her hand, letting Daisy approach at her own pace. The dog's response was cautious, but trusting. She sniffed Grace's fingers and allowed her to stroke her nose through the chain link. "How long has she been refusing food?" Grace asked Maria. 3 days now. She'll drink a little water, but she won't touch the kibble. We've tried different brands, even some wet food, but nothing interests her." Grace nodded. She'd seen this before in dogs who'd been closely bonded with their owners. Depression, the veterinarians called it, though Grace preferred to think of it as grief. Dogs understood loss, even if they couldn't articulate it, and some responded to separation by simply shutting down. What's her timeline? She's been here 6 days. If no one claims her by Monday, she'll be available for adoption after that. Maria shrugged sadly. Grace stood and brushed the dust from her jeans. "I'd like to meet her owner." The meeting between Grace Williams and Ray Morgan took place in the jail's attorney conference room on Saturday morning. Grace had insisted on seeing Ray in person before making any commitments, and Sarah had arranged the meeting as part of Ray's legal consultation. Grace studied Ray carefully as he entered the small room. She'd learned over the years that you could tell a lot about people by how they carried themselves in difficult circumstances. Ray moved with the quiet dignity of someone who was embarrassed by his situation, but not broken by it. "Mr. Morgan," Grace said, extending her hand. "I'm Grace Williams. Sarah told me about your situation with Daisy." Ray shook her hand gratefully. "Thank you for coming. I know you don't have any reason to help us." "Actually, I do," Grace replied, settling into her chair. "I've been rescuing dogs for 15 years, and I've learned that the bond between a person and their dog is one of the most honest relationships in the world. Dogs don't care if you're rich or poor, employed or homeless. They care if you love them and treat them well. From what I've heard, you've been taking good care of Daisy under very difficult circumstances." Ray's eyes filled with tears. "She's all I have left." Grace nodded. "Sarah tells me you're willing to sign papers giving me temporary custody of Daisy until you're released. But I need to understand what happens after that. Where are you going to live? How are you going to support yourself and a dog?" Ray had been dreading this question because he didn't have good answers. "I don't know yet. I'm hoping I can find work when I get out. Maybe save enough for a deposit on a small apartment that allows pets. I know it's not much of a plan." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Morgan, I'm going to be very direct with you. I've fostered dogs for people who made promises they couldn't keep. I've had people disappear when their situations got complicated, leaving me with animals I couldn't place elsewhere. I need to know that you're committed to reclaiming Daisy, no matter what it takes. I am, Ray said without hesitation. She stayed with me when I lost everything else. I won't abandon her. Something in Ray's voice convinced Grace that he meant every word. All right, I'll take Daisy on Monday morning, assuming the paperwork goes through. But I'm not just offering to warehouse your dog, Mr. Morgan. I'm offering to help you both get back on your feet. Ray looked puzzled. What do you mean? I mean that Tom and I have a guest cottage on our property. It's small, just one room with a kitchenette and bathroom, but it's clean and warm. If you're serious about rebuilding your life, I'm willing to offer you temporary housing when you're released from jail. In exchange, you'd help with the rescue operation, feeding dogs, cleaning kennels, basic maintenance work. It's not glamorous, and it doesn't pay much, but it would give you time to look for permanent employment. Ray stared at her in disbelief. After months of having every door slammed in his face, this stranger was offering him not just help with Daisy, but a chance to start over. I don't understand, he said finally. Why would you do this for someone you just met? Grace smiled for the first time since entering the room. Because 15 years ago, Tom and I were going through a difficult time. Our marriage was in trouble. We were both drinking too much, and we were heading toward divorce. A friend suggested we volunteer at the animal shelter, thinking it might give us something positive to focus on together. It saved our marriage, Mr. Morgan. Sometimes helping others is just another way of helping yourself. The newspaper article that Margaret had shown Ray during her visit proved to be more significant than either of them had anticipated. Jennifer Baldy, the reporter who'd written the piece about Springfield's growing homeless population, had received a dozen calls from readers asking about the man whose dog was at the animal shelter. Some wanted to help with Daisy's care, others offered job leads or temporary housing, and a few simply wanted to express sympathy for Ray's situation. Eddie Rodriguez learned about the community response when his girlfriend Carmen visited him. That weekend, Carmen worked as a cashier at the grocery store downtown, and she'd overheard several customers discussing the newspaper article at her checkout line. People are talking about your cellmate, Carmen told Eddie during their brief visit. There's something on Facebook about his dog. Some lady started a page to help find him housing when he gets out. Eddie relayed this information to Ray that evening as they lay in their bunks, listening to the familiar sounds of the jail settling into night shift routines. Ray found it hard to believe that strangers were concerning themselves with his problems, but Eddie understood the power of a story that resonated with people's fears about their own security. See, that's the thing about being homeless, Eddie explained. Most people are scared it could happen to them. Middle-class folks see a guy like you, steady job, married, seem to be doing everything right, and they think if it could happen to him, it could happen to me. Makes them want to help. The Facebook page Carmen had mentioned was the creation of Grace Williams, who'd recognized that Ray's case had touched something in the community's collective conscience. She'd posted a simple message explaining Ray's situation, Daisy's timeline at the shelter, and her offer to provide temporary foster care. Within 24 hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times and attracted dozens of supportive comments. More importantly, it had caught the attention of other animal advocates, local business owners, and residents who'd been quietly concerned about the growing visibility of homelessness in Springfield. Grace found herself fielding phone calls from people who wanted to help but weren't sure how. Tom Williams, Grace's husband, had initially been skeptical about his wife's plan to take on Ray's case. At 71, Tom had seen enough of human nature to be cautious about getting involved in other people's problems. But when Grace showed him the community response to their Facebook post, he began to understand that this was about more than just one man and his dog. It's like people have been waiting for a chance to do something, Tom observed as they read through the online comments together. Everyone's got opinions about homelessness, but most folks don't know how to actually help. Grace had been thinking the same thing. Over her years of rescue work, she'd learned that people wanted to make a difference, but often felt overwhelmed by the scope of social problems. Ray's story offered something manageable, a specific person and dog who needed help, with clear actions that could lead to a positive outcome. Judge Patricia Henley had been following Ray's case with more interest than she typically showed in routine trespass charges. Something about his quiet dignity during the plea hearing had reminded her of her father, who'd served in Korea and struggled with his own demons after returning home. When her clerk mentioned that Ray's case had been featured in the newspaper, Judge Henley found herself reading the article twice. Her father, Daniel Henley, had been a good man who'd been broken by war and struggled to find his place in civilian life. He'd battled alcoholism for years before finally getting sober, but not before losing jobs, relationships, and nearly his family's respect. Judge Henley had been 12 years old when her father disappeared for 3 weeks, sleeping rough in downtown Chicago, before her uncle found him and brought him home. That experience had shaped Patricia Henley's understanding of how quickly circumstances could change for anyone. Her father had eventually rebuilt his life, found steady work as a mechanic, and became the kind of grandfather who never missed a school play or birthday party. But Judge Henley had never forgotten how close they'd come to losing him to the streets. On Monday morning, Grace Williams arrived at the Springfield Animal Shelter with a transport carrier and all the paperwork necessary to take custody of Daisy. Maria Santos had processed dozens of similar transfers over the years, but something about this case felt different. The community attention, the Facebook posts, the phone calls from people asking about Ray and Daisy, it suggested that some stories had the power to connect with people in ways that transcended the usual bureaucratic procedures. Daisy seemed to sense that something was changing. When Grace approached her kennel, the golden retriever stood and wagged her tail for the first time since Ray's arrest. It wasn't the enthusiastic greeting she would have given her beloved owner, but it was a sign that she hadn't given up entirely. "Come on, girl," Grace said gently, clipping a leash to Daisy's collar. "Let's get you out of here." The drive to Grace's property took 20 minutes through the rolling farmland south of Springfield. Daisy rode in the back seat, pressing her nose to the window and watching the countryside pass by. Grace found herself talking to the dog, explaining what would happen next, knowing that Daisy couldn't understand the words, but hoping she might catch the tone of kindness and reassurance. Grace's property was everything she'd described to Ray, and more. The main house was a restored farmhouse with a wraparound porch and mature oak trees that provided shade for the various outbuildings scattered across the 10 acres. Tom had converted an old barn into a rehabilitation facility for dogs recovering from surgery or behavioral issues, complete with individual runs and a small veterinary treatment area. The guest cottage sat about 50 yards from the main house, connected by a gravel path lined with wildflowers that Grace planted every spring. It was simple but comfortable. One large room with a kitchenette, a small bathroom, and windows that looked out over the pasture where Tom kept his 2 rescue horses. Daisy explored the cottage cautiously, sniffing every corner and paying particular attention to the places where previous guests had left their scents. Grace had prepared a comfortable bed in the corner, along with food and water bowls and a basket of toys donated by other rescue volunteers. "This is going to be your home for a while," Grace told Daisy. "Ray's going to come get you as soon as he can." For the first time in a week, Daisy ate a full meal. Back at the jail, Ray was struggling to process the news that Sarah Chen brought during her Wednesday visit. Not only had Grace successfully taken custody of Daisy, but the Facebook post about Ray's situation had generated enough community interest to attract the attention of a local television station. "Channel 20 wants to interview you," Sarah explained. "They're doing a story about homelessness and the challenges facing people trying to get back on their feet. It would be filmed here at the jail, and you'd have complete control over what questions you answer." Ray's first instinct was to decline. The idea of discussing his personal failures on television seemed like an invitation for judgment and pity. two things he'd worked hard to avoid, even in his current circumstances. But Sarah pressed him to consider the potential benefits. "Ray, you've become a symbol for people who are concerned about homelessness in our community. Your story is resonating because you represent the working people who've been left behind by economic changes. If you're willing to tell your story publicly, it might help other people in similar situations." Eddie Rodriguez had been listening to the conversation with the attention of someone who understood the power of public perception. When Sarah left, he offered Ray some practical advice about dealing with media attention. "The thing about being on TV," Eddie said, "is that people are going to make up their minds about you in the first 30 seconds. You can't control that, but you can control whether you tell your own story or let other people tell it for you." Ray spent the next 2 days thinking about Eddie's words. He'd spent the past year feeling ashamed of his circumstances, trying to remain invisible while navigating systems designed to help people like him. But invisibility hadn't protected him from judgment. It had just ensured that when people saw him sleeping rough or standing in line at the food pantry, they filled in their own explanations for his situation. The television interview took place in the jail's conference room on Friday afternoon. The reporter, Michael Chen, no relation to Sarah, was younger than Ray had expected, but he approached the story with sensitivity and genuine curiosity about the factors that contributed to homelessness in small Midwestern cities. "Mr. Morgan," Michael began, "you worked at Springfield Manufacturing for 23 years before the plant closed. Can you tell us what that job meant to you?" Ray found himself talking about more than just employment. He described the pride he'd felt in producing quality parts, the relationships he'd built with co-workers, the sense of stability that had allowed him and Margaret to plan for the future. He talked about the dignity of work and the devastating impact of losing not just income, but identity and purpose. When Michael asked about his relationship with Daisy, Ray's voice softened. He explained how rescuing an older dog had taught him about loyalty and unconditional love, and how Daisy's presence had made the worst moments of his homelessness bearable. "What do you want people to understand about homelessness?" Michael asked. Ray was quiet for a moment, thinking about Eddie's story, about the other men he'd met in jail who were cycling through the same systems of poverty and temporary assistance. "I want them to understand that it can happen to anyone," Ray said finally. "I did everything I was supposed to do. I worked hard, paid my taxes, tried to be a good neighbor. But when the plant closed and I couldn't find another job, all those years of doing the right thing didn't protect me from ending up on the streets. The safety net that's supposed to catch people when they fall, it has holes in it, big ones." The interview aired the following Sunday evening, just 3 days before Ray's scheduled release from jail. By Monday morning, Grace Williams had received calls from over 50 people wanting to help with Ray's transition back into the community. Judge Patricia Henley's office occupied a corner of the courthouse's second floor, with tall windows that looked out over Springfield's downtown square. On the wall behind her desk hung her law degree from the University of Illinois, several commendations from the Illinois State Bar Association, and a single black-and-white photograph of a young man in military uniform. Most visitors assumed the photo was her husband or son, but it was actually her father, Staff Sergeant Daniel Henley, taken shortly before his deployment to Korea in 1951. Patricia kept her father's Bronze Star medal in the bottom drawer of her desk, wrapped in the same tissue paper it had been stored in since his funeral 12 years earlier. She rarely looked at it, but knowing it was there provided a connection to the man who'd shaped her understanding of courage, sacrifice, and redemption. Daniel Henley had returned from Korea in 1953 as one of the lucky ones, physically intact, and officially classified as a hero for his actions during the Battle of Porkchop Hill. But like many veterans of that forgotten war, he'd brought invisible wounds that would take decades to heal. He'd struggled with nightmares, sudden rages, and a drinking problem that cost him jobs, friendships, and nearly his marriage to Patricia's mother. Patricia had been 8 years old when her father disappeared for 3 weeks in the winter of 1962. He'd been laid off from his job at the steel plant and had started drinking heavily, disappearing for days at a time. One morning, her mother found a note saying he was ashamed of what he'd become and couldn't bear to hurt his family anymore. For 21 days, Patricia and her mother had lived with the uncertainty of not knowing whether Daniel Henley was alive or dead. Her Uncle Frank had found him living under a bridge in downtown Chicago, 50 pounds thinner and suffering from frostbite on his hands and feet. Daniel had been ready to die, convinced that his family would be better off without him. But Frank had refused to give up on his brother, bringing him home and helping him through the long process of getting sober and rebuilding his life. The transformation hadn't been quick or easy. Daniel had attended Alcoholics Anonymous meetings for the rest of his life, working as a mechanic and slowly earning back his family's trust. But he'd become a different man, gentler, more empathetic, with a deep understanding of how quickly circumstances could destroy a person's sense of worth. He'd spent his later years mentoring other veterans and volunteering at homeless shelters, always carrying business cards for social services agencies in case he met someone who needed help. Judge Henley had watched her father's journey from broken veteran to community pillar, and it had influenced every decision she'd made in her legal career. As a prosecutor, she'd been known for seeking treatment rather than punishment for defendants struggling with addiction or mental health issues. As a judge, she'd become an advocate for drug courts, veterans courts, and other programs designed to address the root causes of criminal behavior rather than simply warehousing people in jail. When Ray Morgan's case had first appeared on her docket, Judge Henley had seen it as a routine trespass charge, unfortunate but straightforward. A homeless man sleeping in an abandoned building, no prior record, likely to plead guilty and serve 30 days. But something about Ray's demeanor during his plea hearing had reminded her of her father during his darkest period. The quiet dignity of someone who was ashamed of his circumstances but hadn't lost his fundamental decency. After Ray's television interview aired, Judge Henley had done something she rarely did with closed cases. She'd researched his background more thoroughly. What she found confirmed her initial impression. Ray's military service record showed 4 years of exemplary conduct, with commendations for reliability and leadership. His employment history at Springfield Manufacturing revealed a model worker who'd missed only 12 days in 23 years, usually for family emergencies or medical appointments. Most telling were the testimonial letters that had begun arriving at the courthouse from community members who'd seen the television interview. Grace Williams had submitted a detailed report on Daisy's progress and Ray's commitment to reclaiming his dog. Margaret Morgan had written a carefully worded letter explaining the circumstances of their divorce and testifying to Ray's character, even during their most difficult times. Even Maria Santos from the animal shelter had sent a note describing Ray's obvious love for Daisy and his cooperation during the difficult process of surrendering her to the city's care. Judge Henley had been thinking about her father's story when Sarah Chen requested an unusual post-sentencing conference. Sarah had never asked for such a meeting before, and her request letter had been cryptically worded, mentioning only new developments in the Ray Morgan case that might be relevant to the court's ongoing consideration of similar matters. The meeting took place in Judge Henley's chambers on the Wednesday before Ray's scheduled release. Sarah had brought a thick folder containing what she described as community impact documentation, letters, emails, social media posts, and news articles about Ray's case and its effect on local conversations about homelessness and veterans issues. Your Honor, Sarah began, I know it's unusual to revisit a case after sentencing, but I believe Mr. Morgan's situation has evolved in ways that might be instructive for the court's future handling of similar cases. Judge Henley reviewed the materials Sarah had brought, including a petition signed by over 300 community members asking that Ray's case be reconsidered in light of the circumstances that had led to his homelessness and his obvious commitment to rehabilitating his life. There were job offers from local employers, housing leads from landlords willing to work with someone in Ray's situation, and offers of ongoing support from veterans organizations and homeless advocacy groups. Ms. Chen, Judge Henley said carefully, I appreciate the community's interest in Mr. Morgan's welfare, but I'm not sure what you're asking me to do. He's scheduled for release in 3 days, having served his sentence minus time for good behavior. Sarah leaned forward. Your Honor, I'm asking you to consider whether there might be value in acknowledging the community support Mr. Morgan has received and perhaps addressing some of the systemic issues his case has highlighted. The media attention has created an opportunity to discuss how our legal system handles people who are criminalized, essentially for being homeless. Judge Henley was quiet for a long moment, thinking about her father's experience with both the justice system and the community support that had ultimately saved his life. Daniel Henley had never been arrested for his homelessness, but only because his family had found him before the police did. In a different time, or with different circumstances, he might easily have been the one standing before a judge, homeless and desperate, trying to explain why sleeping under a bridge wasn't a moral failing, but a consequence of untreated trauma and societal neglect. Ms. Chen, Judge Henley said finally, I've been thinking about Mr. Morgan's case quite a bit since his sentencing. Not because I have any doubts about the appropriateness of the sentence, but because it's raised questions about how we address the underlying issues that lead to situations like his. Sarah nodded encouragingly. The community response has been remarkable. I think people see Mr. Morgan as representative of a larger problem, but also as proof that individuals can overcome these circumstances with appropriate support. Judge Henley walked to her window and looked out over the downtown square, where she could see several people who were obviously homeless, sitting on benches or walking with their possessions in shopping carts. Springfield wasn't a large city, but it was big enough to have all the social problems that plagued urban areas throughout the Midwest. What kind of support system has Mrs. Williams arranged for Mr. Morgan's release? She asked. Sarah opened her folder to a detailed transition plan that Grace Williams had submitted. It included temporary housing, part-time employment at the dog rescue operation, connections with veterans services organizations, and a timeline for helping Ray find permanent employment and housing. There were backup plans for various contingencies, and contact information for dozens of community members who'd volunteered to help with different aspects of Ray's reintegration. It's quite comprehensive, Judge Henley observed. Mrs. Williams has clearly thought this through very carefully. She has, Your Honor, and I think her approach could serve as a model for how the community might support other people in similar situations. Mr. Morgan's case has demonstrated that there are resources available if we can coordinate them effectively. Judge Henley returned to her desk and pulled open the bottom drawer, looking at the tissue-wrapped bronze star that represented her father's service and sacrifice. She thought about the long journey from his darkest moments under that Chicago bridge to his eventual role as a pillar of their small community. The difference had been people who refused to give up on him, who saw past his immediate circumstances to the man he could become again. Ms. Chen, she said, I'd like you to arrange for me to meet with Mr. Morgan before his release, and I'd like Mrs. Williams to be present as well. I think there might be an opportunity here to do something that goes beyond the routine processing of his case. Sarah looked puzzled. What did you have in mind, Your Honor? Judge Henley smiled, a rare occurrence in her professional setting. I'm thinking about the power of community support and second chances. My father once told me that redemption isn't something you earn alone. It's something you accept from people who see your worth even when you can't see it yourself. She paused, looking again at the photograph on her wall. I think Mr. Morgan's case might provide an opportunity to demonstrate that principle in action. Sometimes the most important thing a judge can do isn't just impose a sentence. It's recognize when a community has come together to ensure that sentence leads to genuine rehabilitation rather than just punishment. Judge Henley pulled out her calendar and began making notes. Schedule the meeting for Friday morning, Miss Chen, and ask Mrs. Williams to bring documentation of all the support systems they've arranged. I think it's time for this court to acknowledge that justice isn't just about following the law. It's about helping people find their way back to being productive members of the community that was willing to give them a second chance. Ray Morgan woke before dawn on his final morning in the Sangamon County Jail, his stomach tight with a mixture of anticipation and dread. After 27 days behind bars, the rhythms of institutional life had become familiar. The mechanical sounds of cell doors opening, the shuffle of feet on concrete floors, the voices of guards calling out instructions for the morning routine. Today, all of that would end, but what came next felt as uncertain as the night he'd first slept on the streets with Daisy. Eddie Rodriguez was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bunk and staring at the small window that provided their cell's only glimpse of the outside world. Eddie had 3 more days to serve, and Ray could see the weight of that knowledge in his cellmate's posture. "You scared?" Eddie asked without turning around. Ray considered the question honestly. "Yeah," he admitted. "I've been locked up for almost a month. The world outside feels different now." "It is different," Eddie said. "Not the world. You. You're going to see things you didn't notice before. The way people look at homeless folks. The way they look through them, like they're not even there. That's going to be hard." Ray had been thinking about that very thing. Before his own experience with homelessness, he'd passed by panhandlers and rough sleepers without really seeing them as individuals with stories and circumstances. Now he understood that he'd been one catastrophic event away from joining them all along. "Eddie," Ray said, "when you get out next week, Grace Williams says there might be work for you at the dog rescue if you're interested. It's not much money, but it's honest work, and Grace is good people." Eddie finally turned to look at Ray, and there were tears in his eyes. "You'd do that for me? Even after everything? You helped me survive in here. That matters." The morning proceeded with unusual activity for a routine release day. Sarah Chen arrived early with a folder full of paperwork and what she described as last-minute developments in Ray's case. A few minutes later, a corrections officer informed Ray that Judge Henley had requested to meet with him in the courthouse conference room before his official release. "That's not normal, is it?" Ray asked Sarah as they walked through the courthouse corridors. "No, it's not," Sarah replied. "But nothing about your case has been normal. Judge Henley specifically asked for Mrs. Williams to be present as well. I think she wants to acknowledge the community support you've received." The conference room was larger than the attorney meeting spaces Ray had grown accustomed to, with a polished table that could seat 12 people and windows that looked out over Springfield's downtown business district. Grace Williams was already there, along with a woman Ray didn't recognize, a professional-looking African-American woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Dr. Monica Richardson from the Springfield Veterans Affairs Office. Judge Henley entered exactly at 9 o'clock, still wearing her judicial robes, but carrying herself with less formality than Ray remembered from his sentencing hearing. She shook hands with everyone present and took a seat at the head of the table, rather than standing behind the bench that usually separated her from defendants. "Mr. Morgan," Judge Henley began, "I asked for this meeting because your case has generated significant community interest and has raised important questions about how our legal system addresses homelessness and the challenges facing veterans transitioning to civilian life. Ray nodded but remained silent, unsure what response was expected. I've received over 50 letters from community members who've been following your story, the judge continued. I've also reviewed the comprehensive support plan that Mrs. Williams has developed for your transition back into the community. It's remarkable, frankly. In 23 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such an organized effort to help someone rebuild their life. Grace Williams leaned forward. Your Honor, Ray's case has touched something in our community. People want to help, but they often don't know how. His story has provided a focus for that desire to make a difference. Judge Henley nodded. Dr. Richardson, would you like to explain why you're here? Dr. Richardson opened a folder and addressed Ray directly. Mr. Morgan, the VA has been following your case through media reports, and we've identified some services you may be eligible for that weren't explored when you first became homeless. There are housing assistance programs, job training opportunities, and healthcare benefits that could provide significant support as you work to rebuild your life. Ray felt overwhelmed by the attention and support. I don't understand why everyone is doing this for me, he said quietly. Judge Henley stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city where Ray would soon be trying to rebuild his life. When she turned back to face the room, her expression was softer than Ray had ever seen it. Mr. Morgan, I'm going to tell you something I don't often share in professional settings. My father was a Korean War veteran who struggled with many of the same challenges you faced. He lost jobs due to what we now understand as PTSD. He battled alcoholism. He experienced homelessness. For 3 weeks in 1962, my family didn't know if he was alive or dead. Ray listened, with growing understanding. Judge Henley wasn't just a judicial officer processing his case. She was someone who'd watched a loved one navigate similar struggles. My father survived because people refused to give up on him, she continued. My uncle found him and brought him home. Community members gave him work when other employers wouldn't take a chance on someone with his record. Veterans organizations provided support that wasn't available through official channels. Over time, he rebuilt his life and became someone who helped other veterans facing similar challenges. Judge Henley returned to her seat. Your case has demonstrated that our community still has that capacity for supporting people who are working to overcome difficult circumstances. But it's also shown that we need better systems for identifying and helping people before they reach crisis points. Sarah Chen spoke up. Your Honor, are you suggesting some kind of formal program? I'm suggesting that Mr. Morgan's experience could serve as a model for how we approach similar cases in the future. Mrs. Williams has created what amounts to a comprehensive re-entry program. Dr. Richardson has identified services that could have prevented Mr. Morgan's homelessness if they'd been accessed earlier. The community response has shown that there are resources available if we can coordinate them effectively. Ray found his voice. Your Honor, I'm grateful for all of this support, but I still don't understand what you want from me. Judge Henley smiled, the first time Ray had seen such an expression from her. Mr. Morgan, I want you to succeed. I want you to rebuild your life and reconnect with your dog and find stability and purpose. But I also want your experience to help other people who might find themselves in similar circumstances. She pulled a document from her folder and slid it across the table to Ray. This is a formal certificate acknowledging your service to our country and the community's commitment to supporting your successful reintegration. It's not a legal document, but it is a public statement that your worth as a person isn't diminished by the temporary circumstances that led to your homelessness. Ray read the certificate with growing emotion. It was printed on official courthouse letterhead and signed by Judge Henley, Grace Williams, Dr. Richardson and Mayor Janet Foster, whose signature surprised Ray since he'd never met her. The language was formal but heartfelt, acknowledging both his service and the community's investment in his future success. There's something else, Grace Williams said, pulling out her phone. "The local news stations have asked to cover your release. They want to follow up on your story and document the support network that's developed around your case. You don't have to participate, but it might help other people understand that homelessness can be addressed with coordinated community effort." Ray thought about Eddie's advice regarding media attention and his own experience with the television interview that had generated so much community support. Would it help other people in situations like mine? "I believe it would," Dr. Richardson answered. "Your story has already prompted changes in how our VA office reaches out to veterans who might be at risk of homelessness. Other communities have contacted us asking about replicating the support model Mrs. Williams developed for your case." Judge Henley stood, indicating that the meeting was concluding. "Mr. Morgan, you'll be officially released at noon today. Your probation requirements are minimal: monthly check-ins with a probation officer and completion of 40 hours of community service, which Mrs. Williams has arranged for you to fulfill at the dog rescue. Mrs. Williams will drive you to her property, where Daisy is waiting for you." Ray's eyes filled with tears at the mention of his dog. After 27 days of separation, the prospect of seeing Daisy again felt almost too good to be true. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of you. I don't know how to repay this kindness." Grace Williams gathered her papers and stood to leave. "Mr. Morgan, the best way to repay kindness is to pass it forward. Your story isn't ending today. It's beginning a new chapter. Make it a good one." The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and community members when Ray emerged from the building at exactly noon, squinting in the bright October sunshine that seemed impossibly brilliant after weeks of fluorescent lighting and small windows. Grace Williams stood beside him, her hand gently placed on his elbow to guide him through the unexpected gathering of people who had come to witness his release. Michael Chen from Channel 20 approached with his camera operator, but he waited respectfully until Ray had a moment to adjust to his freedom before asking if he was willing to answer a few questions. Ray looked around at the faces surrounding him, some familiar from his previous television interview, others completely unknown, but uniformly supportive, and realized that his story had become larger than just one man's struggle with homelessness. "Mr. Morgan," Michael began, "how does it feel to be free after 27 days in jail?" Ray considered the question carefully. The truth was more complicated than simple relief. "It feels overwhelming," he said honestly. "I'm grateful to be out, but I'm also aware that I'm facing the same challenges that led to my arrest in the first place: finding work, finding housing, rebuilding my life. The difference now is that I'm not facing those challenges alone." Grace Williams stepped closer to the microphone. "Ray's case has demonstrated what's possible when a community comes together to support someone who's working to overcome difficult circumstances. We've received support from veterans organizations, local employers, housing advocates, and dozens of individual families who simply wanted to help." Dr. Richardson from the VA office was also present, and she used the opportunity to discuss the services available to veterans who might be at risk of homelessness. Mr. Morgan's situation could have been prevented if he'd been connected with appropriate resources when he first lost his job, she explained. "We're working to develop better outreach programs so that other veterans don't have to experience what he's gone through." Ray found himself thinking about Eddie Rodriguez, still sitting in a jail cell 3 days away from his own release. He thought about the other homeless individuals he'd encountered during his months on the streets, people whose stories were just as compelling as his own, but who hadn't captured the community's attention in the same way. "I want people to understand that my situation isn't unique," Ray said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "There are dozens of people in Springfield right now who are struggling with homelessness, unemployment, and the same challenges I've faced. The support I've received has been incredible, but it shouldn't take media attention and community campaigns to help people who are trying to rebuild their lives." Judge Henley had remained in the background, during the impromptu press conference, but she stepped forward when Ray finished speaking. Mr. Morgan's case has been instructive for everyone involved in our local justice system, she said. It's reminded us that criminal charges sometimes stem from social problems rather than criminal intent, and that addressing those underlying problems requires community-wide solutions. Margaret Morgan appeared at the edge of the crowd, and Ray felt his heart skip when he saw her. She was carrying a small bag and wearing the blue scarf she'd knitted for him years earlier. When the reporters finished their questions and the crowd began to disperse, she approached Ray with the hesitant demeanor of someone unsure of her welcome. "Hello, Ray," she said quietly. "Margaret." Ray wasn't sure what else to say. Their last conversation had been during her visit to the jail, which felt simultaneously recent and like a lifetime ago. "I brought you some things," she said, handing him the bag. "Clean clothes, your father's watch, and a few other items I thought you might want." Ray looked inside the bag and found shirts and jeans he recognized from their life together, along with the silver watch his father had given him when he graduated from high school. The watch had stopped working years earlier, but Ray had kept it because it was one of the few things he owned that connected him to his family's past. "Thank you," Ray said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did," Margaret interrupted gently. "Ray, I know our marriage didn't survive the stress of everything that happened, but that doesn't mean I stopped caring about you. Watching you on television, seeing how you've handled all of this, it reminded me of the man I fell in love with." Grace Williams approached them tactfully. "Ray, if you're ready, we should head out to the property. Someone's been waiting to see you for almost a month." The drive to Grace's farm took 25 minutes through the countryside south of Springfield. Ray sat in the passenger seat of Grace's pickup truck, watching familiar landscapes pass by, with the heightened awareness of someone experiencing freedom after confinement. The colors seemed more vivid, the sky wider, the sense of movement almost intoxicating after weeks of concrete walls and restricted space. Grace talked about the daily routine at the dog rescue operation, explaining Ray's role and responsibilities, while giving him time to process his return to the outside world. "We usually have between 15 and 20 dogs at any given time," she said. "Most are seniors that other shelters can't place, but some are recovering from medical issues or behavioral problems that require specialized care." "How's Daisy been?" Ray asked, the question he'd been holding back since getting in the truck. Grace smiled. "She's been waiting for you. The first few days were rough. She barely ate, spent most of her time lying by the window looking for your truck. But over the past week, she started to trust that we're taking care of her. She plays with some of the other dogs now, and she's been helping me with the more anxious rescues. She has a gift for calming dogs that are scared or traumatized." When they turned into the gravel driveway that led to Grace's property, Ray could see dogs in various outdoor runs and paddocks scattered across the 10 acres. The main house was a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, and the guest cottage where he'd be living sat about 50 yards away, connected by a stone path lined with late-season flowers. Grace parked the truck near the cottage and turned off the engine. "She's inside," she said simply. "I thought you might want to see her privately first, before you meet the other dogs and get oriented to everything else." Ray approached the cottage door with his heart pounding harder than it had during any moment of his arrest, trial, or imprisonment. He turned the handle and stepped inside to find Daisy lying on a dog bed near the window, her golden coat clean and brushed, her eyes alert and watchful. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ray wondered if a month apart had damaged their bond, if Daisy might have adjusted to life without him and found contentment with Grace and Tom. Then Daisy rose slowly from her bed, approached Ray with careful steps, and pressed her face against his legs with a gentleness that spoke of forgiveness and unconditional love. Ray knelt on the cottage floor and buried his face in Daisy's fur, feeling tears he'd held back for weeks finally flowing freely. Daisy remained perfectly still, allowing him to hold her while making the small whimpering sounds she'd always made when she sensed his distress. "I'm sorry, girl," Ray whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you from all of this." Daisy pulled back and looked at Ray with eyes that held no judgment, no resentment, only the patient love of a companion who'd waited faithfully for his return. She placed her paw on his arm, the same gesture she'd made countless times during their months on the streets when she'd sensed his despair, and offered what comfort she could. Through the cottage window, Ray could see Grace Williams standing by, her truck giving them privacy for their reunion while staying close enough to help if needed. Beyond her, the farm stretched out in all directions, space for dogs to run and heal, space for people to start over, space for the kind of second chances that Ray had almost stopped believing were possible. Ray spent his first hour of freedom sitting on the floor of the guest cottage, with Daisy pressed against his side, both of them adjusting to the reality of being together again. The cottage was simple but comfortable, one large room with a kitchenette, a bathroom and windows that looked out over the pasture where Tom Williams kept his 2 rescue horses. Someone had stocked the refrigerator with basic groceries and left fresh flowers on the small dining table. When Grace finally knocked on the door, Ray had composed himself enough to begin the process of reintegrating into the world, beyond concrete walls and metal bars. Grace entered with Tom Williams, a tall, weathered man in his 70s who moved with the careful precision of someone whose hands had been shaped by decades of physical work. "Ray," Tom said, extending a firm handshake, "welcome to our place. Grace has told me a lot about you and Daisy." Ray stood, keeping one hand on Daisy's head. "Mr. Williams, I can't begin to thank you for what you've done. I know you don't owe me anything, and taking in a stranger with my background," Tom held up a hand to stop him. "Son, we've all made mistakes. What matters is what you do going forward. Grace thinks you're someone worth investing in, and I trust her judgment completely." Grace pulled out a folder containing information about Ray's work responsibilities, the daily routine at the dog rescue, and contact information for the various support services that had been arranged for his transition. "We thought we'd start you off slowly," she said. "Morning feeding, basic kennel maintenance, helping with dog walks and exercise. As you get comfortable, we can expand your responsibilities." Ray looked through the materials, impressed by the thoroughness of the planning. There were schedules, procedures, emergency contact numbers, and even a map of the property with each building and enclosure clearly marked. "This is incredibly organized," he said. "Grace doesn't leave anything to chance," Tom replied with obvious pride in his wife. In 15 years of rescue work, she's never lost a dog or had a volunteer get injured because she plans for every possible situation. They spent the afternoon touring the property and meeting the current residents. 18 dogs ranging in age from 5 to 14, most with medical or behavioral issues that made them difficult to place in traditional homes. Ray was struck by the calm atmosphere of the operation. Despite housing dogs that had been abandoned, abused, or neglected, the rescue felt peaceful rather than chaotic. "The key is routine," Grace explained as they visited each enclosure. "Dogs that have been traumatized need predictability. They need to know that food will come at the same time every day, that their space is secure, that the humans caring for them are reliable." Ray understood the wisdom in this approach. His own experience with homelessness had taught him the value of small routines and predictable safe spaces. The abandoned warehouse where he'd been arrested had represented security precisely because it had been consistent. The same entrance, the same corner where he'd made his bed, the same sense of temporary shelter from an uncertain world. That evening, Grace and Tom invited Ray to dinner at the main house, a meal that felt surreal after weeks of institutional food served on metal trays. Margaret had been invited as well, and Ray found himself sitting around a kitchen table with 3 people who were essentially strangers, but who had shown him more kindness than he'd experienced in months. The conversation was careful at first, with everyone aware of the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. But as the evening progressed, Ray found himself talking about his experience in jail, his fears about the future, and his gratitude for the support he'd received. "Ray," Margaret said as Grace served coffee and homemade pie, "I need to apologize for how things ended between us. I was so focused on my own fear and frustration that I didn't see how much you were struggling." Ray shook his head. "Margaret, you don't owe me an apology. I shut down when I lost my job. I stopped talking to you about what I was feeling. Stopped, including you in decisions about our future. The divorce wasn't your fault." Tom Williams listened to this exchange with the attention of someone who understood marriage difficulties. "Grace and I went through our own rough patch years ago," he said. "Different circumstances, but the same kind of breakdown in communication and trust. The rescue work probably saved our relationship." "How so?" Ray asked. Grace and Tom exchanged a look that spoke of shared history and hard-won understanding. "We were both drinking too much," Grace said simply. "Tom had been laid off from the plant. I was working double shifts at the hospital, and we were taking our stress out on each other instead of supporting each other through a difficult time." Tom nodded. "A friend suggested we volunteer at the animal shelter, thinking it might give us something positive to focus on together. Started with a few hours on weekends, but pretty soon we were spending every free moment there. Gave us a purpose. Beyond our own problems." Ray understood what they were describing. During his months on the streets, caring for Daisy had provided a sense of responsibility and meaning that had kept him from completely losing hope. Even when he couldn't take care of himself properly, he'd made sure Daisy was fed and safe and loved. "The work changes you," Grace continued. "When you're responsible for animals that depend completely on your care, you can't afford to be selfish or short-sighted. You have to show up every day, regardless of how you're feeling or what problems you're facing in other parts of your life." Margaret had been listening thoughtfully to this conversation. "Ray, when you were taking care of Daisy during those months you were homeless, you were still the man I married. You were still putting someone else's needs before your own, still taking responsibility for a life you'd committed to protecting. I should have seen that." Ray felt tears threatening again and excused himself to step outside onto the porch. Daisy followed him, as she always had, and settled beside his chair as he looked out over the property that would be his home for the foreseeable future. The sun was setting behind the barn, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly beautiful after weeks of seeing the world through small windows and chain-link fences. Grace joined him a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling into the adjacent chair. "Overwhelming?" she asked. "Yeah," Ray admitted. "All of this kindness, all of these people who've invested in helping me succeed, it feels like more than I deserve." Grace was quiet for a moment, watching her dogs settle into their evening routines in the various enclosures around the property. "Ray, deserving has nothing to do with it. Daisy didn't deserve to be abandoned by 2 families before you adopted her, but you saw something worth saving and gave her a home. These dogs out here didn't deserve whatever happened to them before they came to us. But we see something worth saving, and we give them care and love until they're ready for their next chapter." She sipped her coffee and continued. "You didn't deserve to lose your job or your marriage or your home, but you also don't deserve to stay lost forever because of things that happened to you. Sometimes accepting help isn't about deserving it. It's about recognizing that healing happens in community, not in isolation." Ray nodded, understanding the truth in her words, but still struggling to fully accept it. "What if I fail? What if I can't maintain stable housing or find permanent employment? What if I let down all these people who've believed in me?" Grace turned to look at him directly. "Then we'll figure out what comes next. Ray, this isn't a test where failure means you're thrown back out on the streets. This is a support system, and support systems are designed to help you through setbacks, not abandon you at the first sign of difficulty." Inside the house, Ray could hear Tom and Margaret talking quietly, their voices mixing with the evening. Sounds of dogs settling into sleep and the gentle lowing of cattle in a distant pasture. For the first time in over a year, Ray felt something he'd almost forgotten, a sense of belonging somewhere, of being part of a community that saw value in his presence and potential in his future. Daisy pressed closer against his legs, and Ray realized that this moment, sitting on a porch with his dog beside him and people inside who cared about his welfare, represented everything he'd thought he'd lost forever when he loaded his possessions into his pickup truck and drove away from Maple Street for the last time. Ray's first month at Williams Dog Rescue passed with the steady rhythm of meaningful work and gradual healing. He woke each morning at 5:30 to the sound of Daisy stirring in her bed beside his, and together they would walk the property in the pre-dawn darkness, checking on the dogs and beginning the feeding routine that structured their days. This work was harder than Ray had anticipated, but satisfying in ways his factory job had never been. Each dog presented unique challenges and needs: aging joints that required medication, behavioral issues that demanded patience and consistency, medical conditions that called for specialized diets and careful monitoring. Ray found himself developing relationships with individual animals, learning their personalities and preferences, celebrating small improvements in their health or temperament. Tom Williams became Ray's mentor in the practical aspects of animal care, teaching him to recognize signs of illness, administer medications, and maintain the detailed records that tracked each dog's progress. The secret, Tom explained during one of their morning rounds, is paying attention to the small changes. Dogs can't tell you when they're not feeling well, so you have to notice when they're eating less, moving differently, or showing subtle changes in behavior. Grace focused on helping Ray develop the interpersonal skills that would be crucial for his long-term success in any career. She taught him to interact confidently with potential adopters, veterinarians, and the volunteers who came to help with weekend activities. More importantly, she helped him rebuild his sense of self-worth by consistently treating him as a valued team member rather than a charity case. Ray's become indispensable, Grace told Margaret during one of her weekly visits. He has a natural gift for working with the more anxious dogs, and the adopters respond well to his quiet, steady demeanor. Margaret had become a regular presence at the rescue, initially visiting to see Ray, but gradually developing her own relationship with the work and the animals. She'd volunteered to help with administrative tasks, maintaining adoption records, and coordinating with veterinary clinics for medical care. Her library background proved valuable for organizing the educational materials Grace provided to new dog owners. The relationship between Ray and Margaret was evolving slowly, built on shared work and honest conversations about their past and their individual growth since the divorce. They were careful not to rush toward any assumptions about their future, but there was an obvious affection and respect growing between them that everyone could see. "We're different people than we were when we were married," Margaret told Grace. One afternoon, as they worked together to update the rescue's website, "Ray has learned things about himself through this experience that he never would have discovered in our comfortable suburban life. And I've learned things about resilience and community that I never understood when I was focused on protecting what we had rather than growing beyond it." Dr. Richardson from the VA office had become a regular consultant on Ray's case, using his successful transition as a model for other programs they were developing throughout central Illinois. Ray's experience had highlighted gaps in veteran services and had led to policy changes that would help identify at-risk veterans before they reached crisis points. Mr. Morgan's case study has been instrumental in securing funding for our outreach programs, Dr. Richardson explained during a meeting with local social service organizations. His story demonstrates that effective intervention can prevent homelessness and incarceration while building long-term stability and community engagement. Judge Henley had followed Ray's progress with the satisfaction of someone who'd made the right decision at a crucial moment. She'd begun incorporating community-based support models into other cases, working with local organizations to develop comprehensive transition plans for defendants whose criminal behavior stemmed from social problems rather than criminal intent. Sarah Chen had used Ray's case as the foundation for her successful application to a fellowship program focused on public defense reform. She was spending a year developing alternative approaches to representing defendants who were criminalized for poverty-related offenses, with Ray's case serving as a demonstration of what was possible when legal advocates worked with community organizations to address underlying causes rather than just processing charges. Eddie Rodriguez had been released from jail 3 days after Ray and had immediately begun working at the dog rescue, as Grace had promised. His experience with addiction and incarceration made him particularly effective at working with volunteers and adopters who had their own complicated histories. Eddie and Ray had developed a friendship based on shared experience and mutual respect, often working together on the more challenging rescue cases. "Ray saved my life," Eddie told a reporter who was doing a follow-up story on the impact of Ray's case 6 months after his release. "Not just by getting me this job, but by showing me what it looks like to rebuild your life with dignity and purpose. When I was in jail, I thought I was just another screw-up who'd never amount to anything, but Ray treated me like someone worth helping, and that made all the difference." The follow-up article appeared in the State Journal-Register on the 1st anniversary of Ray's arrest, with a headline that read, "From Homeless to Helping Others, Springfield Man's Journey Inspires Community Response to Homelessness." The article detailed not just Ray's personal transformation, but the broader changes his case had prompted in how Springfield addressed homelessness, veteran services, and criminal justice reform. Ray was featured prominently in the article, but he'd insisted that the focus be on the community response rather than his individual story. "I was just one person in a difficult situation," he told the reporter. "What's remarkable is how many people stepped up to help and how that help has created ongoing changes that will benefit other people facing similar challenges." The article mentioned that the Williams Dog Rescue had expanded its operations to include a formal program for helping homeless individuals with pets, funded by donations that had poured in after Ray's story gained attention. Grace and Tom had purchased an additional 10 acres and built facilities specifically designed to house people and their animals while they worked towards stable housing and employment. Margaret and Ray's relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected when they'd signed their divorce papers 18 months earlier. They'd remarried in a simple ceremony at the dog rescue the previous spring, with Judge Henley officiating and Daisy serving as an honored member of the wedding party. "We're not the same people who got divorced," Ray explained to friends who asked about their remarriage. "We've both learned things about ourselves and about what really matters in a relationship. Our marriage failed the first time because we couldn't handle crisis together. This time, we've both proven we can handle crisis individually, so we're choosing to face the future together." Their new home was a small house on 5 acres adjacent to the Williams property, with space for Daisy and 2 other senior dogs they'd adopted from the rescue. Ray continued to work full-time at the dog rescue, and Margaret had taken a position with the regional library system, developing literacy programs for adults in transitional housing. On this October morning, exactly 2 years after his arrest, Ray stood in the courthouse square where he'd been released from jail. But this time he was there by choice. He was speaking to a group of social workers, public defenders, and community activists who were participating in a conference on alternatives to incarceration for poverty-related offenses. 2 years ago, I was arrested 50 feet from where we're standing, Ray began, his voice steady and confident. I was homeless, desperate, and convinced that my life was effectively over. I couldn't have imagined that my lowest moment would become the foundation for the most meaningful period of my life. He talked about the people who'd refused to give up on him, Sarah Chen, Grace and Tom Williams, Judge Henley, Margaret, and the dozens of community members who'd offered support without being asked. He talked about the dogs at the rescue who'd taught him about resilience and second chances. Most importantly, he talked about the responsibility that came with receiving help from others. The greatest gift I received wasn't just the assistance that helped me rebuild my life, Ray concluded. It was the opportunity to become someone who could help other people facing similar struggles. Recovery isn't just about getting back what you lost, it's about becoming someone who can contribute to other people's recovery. After his presentation, Ray walked to the animal shelter where he'd said goodbye to Daisy 2 years earlier. The facility had been renovated and expanded with funding that came partly from the community response to his case. Maria Santos, now the director, showed him through the new adoption areas and the medical facilities that allowed them to care for animals with complex health needs. "Your case changed everything for us," Maria told Ray, as they visited the kennels where dozens of dogs awaited adoption. "The community support that developed around your story has sustained itself and grown into ongoing funding for our operations. We're able to keep animals longer, provide better medical care, and work with more rescue organizations to find homes for dogs that might not have had a chance before." Ray spent an hour visiting with the current residents, many of whom were seniors, like Daisy had been when she'd been housed here. He thought about the scared, desperate man who'd knelt outside Kennel 47 2 years earlier, promising a dog he might never see again that he would find her somehow. That afternoon, Ray and Daisy visited Eddie Rodriguez at his own apartment, a one-bedroom place downtown that Eddie had been able to afford after being promoted to supervisor of kennel operations at the rescue. Eddie had adopted a senior pit bull mix named Bruno, and the two men sat on Eddie's small porch, watching their dogs play in the fenced yard. "You ever think about that night in jail when you told me about Grace's offer?" Eddie asked, scratching. "Bruno, behind the ears," Ray smiled. "I think about it all the time. I was so scared that even if I got Daisy back, I wouldn't be able to take care of her properly. I couldn't see past my immediate problems to imagine what was possible." "That's the thing about being in crisis," Eddie replied. "You can't see the future because you're just trying to survive the present. It takes other people believing in your future before you can start believing in it yourself." As evening approached, Ray and Daisy returned to their home where Margaret was preparing dinner and reading adoption applications from families interested in the 3 senior dogs currently housed at the rescue. They developed a routine of reviewing applications together, using their different perspectives to assess which families might provide the best matches for dogs with specific needs. "There's a family in Decatur who's interested in Chester," Margaret said, referring to a 12-year-old beagle mix who'd been returned to the rescue twice because of his separation anxiety. "They're both retired, no other pets, and they specifically want a dog who needs extra attention." Ray reviewed the application while Daisy settled at his feet, her graying muzzle resting on his shoes in the gesture of contentment she'd perfected over their years together. At 11 years old, Daisy moved more slowly than she once had, but her eyes still held the same intelligent warmth that had convinced Ray to adopt her from the shelter years earlier. "Chester would be good for them," Ray agreed. "He needs people who can be patient with his adjustment period, and who understand that some dogs take longer to trust new situations." After dinner, Ray and Margaret walked the property with Daisy, checking on the dogs in their care and enjoying the peaceful sounds of evening in the countryside. The rescue now housed 26 dogs, and Ray knew each one by name, understood their individual needs and personalities, and took personal satisfaction in matching them with families who could provide appropriate homes. "Ray," Margaret said as they completed their circuit of the property, "do you ever regret the path that led us here? I know it was painful, losing your job, our divorce, the homelessness, the arrest. If you could go back and change things, would you?" Ray considered the question seriously, The man he'd been 3 years earlier, employed, housed, married, but also somewhat complacent about his place in the world, seemed like a different person entirely. That Ray had been a good man, but a limited one, focused on his own security and comfort without much thought for people facing different circumstances. "I wouldn't choose to go through it again," Ray said finally, "but I also wouldn't give up what we've learned and what we've become because of it. The work we're doing now, the relationships we've built, the way we understand ourselves and each other, none of that would have been possible if our old life had continued unchanged." They paused at the cottage where Ray had lived during his first months at the rescue, now occupied by a young veteran named Marcus, who was working through his own transition from homelessness to stability. Through the window, they could see Marcus reading to two puppies who'd been rescued from a hoarding situation and needed constant socialization to prepare them for adoption. "Every person who comes through here teaches us something new about resilience and recovery," Margaret observed. "Marcus is showing those puppies that humans can be trusted, but they're also showing him that he's capable of being gentle and nurturing even after everything he's been through." As they returned to their house, Ray thought about the Bronze Star medal that Judge Henley had shown him during one of their follow-up meetings, and the story she'd told about her father's journey from homelessness back to community respect. Judge Henley's father had become a mentor to other veterans, using his experience to help people facing similar struggles. Ray was following a similar path, but his focus had expanded beyond just veteran services to include anyone whose circumstances had pushed them to the margins of society. He regularly spoke at conferences about homelessness and criminal justice reform, but he also spent time at the county jail talking with people facing similar charges, and he worked with local employers to create job opportunities for people with complicated backgrounds. "The key thing I try to tell people," Ray had explained during a recent presentation to the Springfield City Council, "is that homelessness and poverty aren't character flaws. They're usually the result of circumstances that can happen to anyone, and they can be addressed with appropriate support and resources. The question isn't whether people deserve help, it's whether we want to invest in solutions that work." The house key that Grace Williams had given Ray 2 years earlier still hung on his keychain, though he now had keys to his own home, his own truck, and the various buildings at the dog rescue. But he kept Grace's key as a reminder of the moment. When his life had begun to change direction, when a stranger had seen potential in someone that most people would have written off as another casualty of economic dislocation and social neglect. That night, as Ray and Margaret settled into bed, with Daisy curled up on her favorite blanket beside them, Ray reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The scared, desperate man who'd been arrested for trespassing in an abandoned warehouse had been replaced by someone who understood his own worth and his capacity to contribute to other people's welfare. The newspaper clipping from his original arrest still sat in a frame on his dresser, but it was now surrounded by photos from dog adoption events, wedding pictures from his remarriage to Margaret, and a certificate recognizing his volunteer service with the Springfield Veterans Affairs Office. The progression told the story of transformation, not just his own, but the community's response to understanding homelessness as a solvable problem rather than an inevitable tragedy. As Ray drifted off to sleep, he could hear the sounds of the dogs settling into their nighttime routines throughout the property, some sleeping peacefully, others still adjusting to the safety and comfort of having reliable shelter and care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dogs who needed help, new people seeking support in rebuilding their lives. But tonight, Ray Morgan slept in his own bed, in his own home, beside his wife and his dog, surrounded by the community he'd helped create, and that had, in turn, created him anew.